Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to our roundtable, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, implications for the liberal order, organized by the Berlin Cluster of Excellence, contestations of the liberal script. My name is Tobias Rupprecht. I am, amongst other things, a historian of modern Russia. I oversee the work of a research group here at the cluster called Peripheral Liberalism, and we study the history of liberal economists in state socialist countries. It's a sad occasion for this roundtable. In our European neighborhood, residential areas are being bombed from the air, tanks roll through the streets, entire cities are cut off from food and energy supply, thousands of civilians have died, many fear the worst is yet to come. Those of you who, like me, have been glued to the news from Ukraine and Russia, especially if you're connected to social media accounts from people in Ukraine and Russia, can follow a full-blown war in real time. With all the information pouring in from Kiev, Lviv, Mariupol, Kharkiv, etc., it's very difficult to get a good sense of what is happening on the ground beyond the obvious horrors for the population. If we are to believe the many Ukrainian sources on the internet, then Russian troops are about to experience a humiliating defeat at the hands of bravely resisting patriots fighting for Ukrainian freedom and independence. Quite often you also hear and read how those who took up arms against the invaders fight not only for Ukraine, but also for the entire West, or for global ideas of freedom, human rights, and democracy. The liberal script, if you will. Now, I fully sympathize with them, and I sincerely hope they will prevail, but perhaps we shouldn't get carried away with wishful thinking. The depiction in West European media is much more cautious and usually conveys the impression that the Russian victory is only a matter of time, as the Kremlin keeps sending troops and the Russian Air Force applies its carpet bombing strategies as they had done before in the wars in Chechnya and in Syria. Now, I'm afraid we can't say much about the current course of events and the military side of the conflict. We can't gauge the strength of either army, and we can't predict how this disaster will end. We can't look into Putin's head either. What we can do, however, is look at the bigger picture and reflect on the recent history that led to these events and on the political instrumentalization of history. We can talk about the global effects and the worldwide reactions to Russia's invasion. And we can make informed guesses what kinds of shifts in geopolitics we can expect considering different possible scenarios. To this effect, we have brought together a group of specialists and regional experts from our research cluster and affiliated institutions. I'll introduce the speakers in a minute. And just a quick note on the format of the event. We will have a podium discussion for around about 1 hour, and then there will be a chance for the audience to ask questions. We have received some questions already, but you still have the opportunity to send questions to the email that you see now in the box below me. I will present some of these questions to our panelists for roughly half an hour, and then we will hear final statements from our presenters. Now let's introduce the speakers we have with us today. Tanja Jurchenko, a postdoctoral researcher both at Scripps and the Center for East European International Studies, ZEITENWENDE, here in Berlin. Tanja is a political economist and a philosopher, and her research interests are border regions in the post-Soviet space, especially Ukraine, memory politics, and post-conflict societies. I'm particularly happy that we have Tanja with us today. She's from Ukraine herself, and so we have here someone who has an immediate connection to the country that is in focus of our discussion today. We have Professor Katharina Bluhm with us, who is a sociologist and the director of the Institute for East European Studies, also at the Freie Universität Berlin, as well as a principal investigator here at Scripps. Katharina is the Russia expert here on the panel, and she has published research on conservatism and varieties of capitalism in Eastern Europe and Russia. Professor Thomas Risse is the director of the Center for Transnational Relations, Foreign and Security Policy at the Otto Suhr Institute for Political Sciences. He's also a senior professor here at Scripps, and Thomas' expertise includes areas of limited statehood, as well as challenges to the liberal international order. Lunting Wu is a doctoral researcher at Scripps. His research interests are comparative politics and foreign policy analysis. And Lunting is an expert on both China and Latin America and on the political interactions between the two. Joining us from Delhi is Professor Uma Salvabava. She has a chair for European Studies at Nehru University in Delhi. Salma is one of the leading Indian experts on contemporary Europe and Germany. And in her research, she focuses on foreign and security policy in Europe and India. Last but not least, Professor Tanja Börzel, who is a political scientist at Freie Universität Berlin and the director of Scripts. She's not here yet. No, she is here. Hello, Tanja. Good to see you. Tanja studies questions of governance and institutional change, as well as the diffusion of European ideas and policies within and outside the European Union. Now, before we begin our discussion on the ZEITENWENDE, the sea change in contemporary geopolitics, a quick note on history. My job here is mostly that of a moderator, but I'm also the only historian here on this panel. And I do want to share some thoughts on the politicization of history that played a tremendous role in the run-up of this conflict and also in the perception abroad. The Israeli novelist Amos Oz once said that there is a very simple solution to the Middle East conflict and a lot of other geopolitical conflicts as well. The solution is, as soon as any politician starts talking about history, unplug the microphone immediately. Unfortunately, no one pulled the plug on Vladimir Putin as he announced his shambolic interpretation of Russian and Ukrainian history, which basically questioned the existence of a Ukrainian nation and thus the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state, and thus intellectually prepared the invasion. Now, very few people had access to Putin over the past 2 years, and one of the handful was Sergei Narishkin. You may be familiar with Sergei Narishkin because footage of the Russian Security Council meeting briefly before the invasion was aired around the world, and it showed how Putin dressed down Narishkin like a schoolboy in a almost Stalinist inscenation or staging of his power vis-a-vis the rest of the Russian political elite. Narishkin is not only the head of the SVR, the Foreign Secret Service in Russia, but also the head of the Russian Historical Society. And I can vividly imagine Putin and Narishkin, two frantically paranoid former KGB agents, sitting together during Corona lockdowns and confirming each other in their crude views of Russia's glorious 1,000-year history and their own role in it. So following Amos Oz, Putin and Narishkin certainly had better worried about Russia's contemporary problems, of which there are plenty, rather than about their place in history. But we are not politicians, so no one needs to pull the plug on us here. And a bit of a sense of Russian history, I think, does help to contextualize this invasion and some of the conceptions about the role of the West in it. Let's not forget that Russia has a century-old imperial tradition. And in many ways, both in domestic politics as in Russia's relationship with neighboring countries, you can recognize very clear patterns and continuities of the traditional Russian patrimonial state. Russian foreign policy since the mid-1990s, and particularly since the war against Georgia in 2008, is very obviously in this imperial tradition. Gorbachev's imperial retreat in the late 1980s was an exception, not the end of Russian imperialism. All this is to say that this Western habit, especially on the margins of the political spectrum, but not only, to see everything that happens in Russia as a reaction to Western activities is about as convincing as Putin's history lesson. NATO eastward expansion is not the cause for Putin's irredentism. NATO did not bother the Russian political leadership much in the early 2000s, but it still seemed on a more or less liberal track. But once they fully re-embraced Russia's imperial tradition, NATO became a convenient excuse, a scarecrow to rally the population behind the flag, to create a myth of encirclement, and this is a strategy we know very well from earlier phases of Russian and Soviet history. Now, it may well be that Putin and Narishkin eventually became victims of their own propaganda, but we should not. There were no plans whatsoever in the past years to grant any closer NATO cooperation to Ukraine. Russia invaded anyway. Well, just think of Belarus. There was never any talk on either side of Belarus joining NATO, which didn't save the country from becoming a Russian satellite either. And the imperialist mindset of the current Russian political elite, which unfortunately I think is shared by large parts of the Russian population, is not a reaction to NATO. It's not a reaction to what the IMF did in Russia. It's not a reaction to George Soros. It's not a reaction to economic hardships that Russia experienced in the 1990s. Quite to the contrary. This reconnection to Russia's imperial traditions began at a time when Russia was economically booming and relations with the great powers of the West were better than ever. A couple of days after the invasion, I wrote a text for the blog of scripts expressing the hope that this invasion would finally mean the end of this kind of comprehension for Putin and Russia's foreign policy, the what we call in German, the Putin-Verstehers. Well, it took about a week until a whole wave of texts circulated online about how the West created Putin, how the dictatorship of the IMF and Western imposed shock therapy led to Russia's aggression, how NATO violated Russia's ostensibly legitimate security interest, and so forth. And I really hope that these kind of dubious interpretations of Russian history remain on the margins from now on and no longer inform Western policy on Eastern Europe and Russia. Enough history. Let's talk about the present. My first question for this roundtable is for Tatiana. So Tatiana, over the past 2 weeks, a debate has emerged in the West about the ways in which the conflict can be brought to a halt. So one side argues that there is no point in negotiating with an aggressive, chronically lying, or even outright crazy Putin. And realists say that eventually compromises will have to be made, including in Kiev. Could you give us a sense of what is being discussed in Ukraine at the moment? Is there any kind of public debate at all possible under the circumstances of war? And what kind of compromises might the current government be willing to make? What are the red lines? And how far do you think they can go without losing their legitimacy vis-a-vis the Ukrainian population?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this roundtable. It's difficult, actually probably one of the most difficult occasions for me to talk about Ukraine. I'm neither an expert on war and military conflicts, nor I have an access to any insider information on negotiations or what the Ukrainian government is going to do. So what I can share with you tonight is just some personal thoughts. And it's difficult to answer the question you asked because we don't really know what are the aims of Putin's regime in Ukraine. What is he trying to achieve? And as our chair just mentioned, we know these messages coming from Putin's history writing that Ukraine is, as a state, has never existed. It's not even a state. We also hear these messages that Ukrainians and Russians are one single people. Ukrainians should be liberated from the nationalists in Kiev and from the Nazis, which took power back in 2014. We also hear that Russia is fighting the Western liberal order. And even from the patriarch of the Moscow Orthodox Church, we hear that Russia is protecting the people of Donbass from the LGBT propaganda. So is it just for the Russian TV audience, or is it really in Putin's hand? Unfortunately, probably also in Putin's hand, and not only in his head. Yeah. So it's difficult to explain the decision to launch a full-scale war on Ukraine from a rational point of view, because actually 4 weeks ago, anybody hardly believed that Russia is going to recognize the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk republics, because the Minsk agreement was effectively used by Russia as a leverage to immobilize Ukraine. Yeah? There was nothing Ukraine could do, for example, to prevent the passportization of its citizens in Donbass. And of course, Kyiv never seriously considered getting back occupied territories by military force. Yeah? Now that the Russian blitzkrieg has failed after almost like 3 weeks of the invasion, and isn't it funny that Germans, Russians, and Ukrainians actually have this word blitzkrieg in our vocabulary, and we all understand what does it mean without translation. So Russia is now trapped into a protracted military conflict similar to the Soviet operation in Afghanistan, and it gets very costly for Russia with every day, also due to the unprecedented sanctions. But Ukraine is also suffering immense human losses and the destruction of civilian infrastructure of an unimaginable scale. So how this madness can be stopped? It would be, of course, just beautiful if Putin's regime would collapse, but it's too nice to be to hope. Yeah, and we know that negotiations are going between the Ukrainian and the Russian side, but we know very little about the details. We also have to understand that Russians keep hitting Ukraine by rockets and bombs while the negotiations are going. So there is no ceasefire. And it's a little bit like back in 2014 in Ilovaisk and in 2015 in Debaltseve, when Ukraine was forced to make secessions by the use of military force by Russians on the Ukrainian territory. But the scale is, of course, uncomparable. So I was asked to comment on this question, if there is a public debate in Ukraine, how far one can go, what are the red lines, and if Ukrainian society is willing to accept a certain deal with Russians or not. Yeah. And of course, I have to say that the situation is very dynamic. It's difficult to say what will happen tomorrow. So to go through the list of what we kind of think are the demands of the Russian side, because we don't know for sure what is formulated as a list of the Russian demands. I think what concerns the NATO membership and the neutral status of Ukraine, here the first thing I want to say is actually that the support for the NATO membership in Ukraine is now very high. It's the highest for the whole history of Ukraine. I think last week it was like 76%. Now it's a bit less, 72, according to the opinion polls. And this 4% drop has to do with this perception that NATO is not active enough in protecting Ukraine and closing the sky, for example, which is the main demand from Ukraine. But I think in this question of the neutral status, the signals coming from the government, coming from the office of the president are rather kind of preparing the ground that Ukraine, we are not in the NATO anyway. We are not going to be accepted. We are not even invited. So this is something which probably would be the easiest to sell to the Ukrainian public if we give up this NATO accession perspective. Another question is territorial secession. So the Crimea and the occupied territories in Donbass, the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk republics, Russia wants that Ukraine accepts the fact that Crimea is now Russian and also recognizes the independence of the both so-called republics in its administrative borders. This is a more difficult question, and the opinion polls show that Ukrainians are not going to make are not prepared to do this. And actually, in the last weeks, the share of people who say that Ukraine should try to get these territories back have risen, and especially in the case of Crimea, it was, I think, in the last years, it was clear that if Ukraine is going to get it back, then it's going to happen only when Russia is going to disintegrate or something like that through diplomatic means, or the Putin regime is going to collapse. With the Lugansk and Donetsk republics, to give up territories which the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian state was actually keeping and trying to somehow to also to develop and to the Kiev-controlled parts of these administrative units. I think this is going to be very, very difficult to sell. Yeah. Demilitarization. Again, we don't know what does it mean. Ukraine is only allowed to have defensive weapons, but actually it only has defensive weapons. I'm not a military expert, so I don't know here what does it mean and how actually concrete are Russia's demands. Denazification, what the hell does this mean? I don't know. So to translate it from Putin to English, maybe language, it would mean that no political parties would be allowed in Ukraine rather than pro-Russian parties. I don't know if any parties at all, yeah? So again, how is this going to happen? Who and how is going to enforce it is a very big question. Regime change in Ukraine. Sometimes Russia says they don't want regime change, they recognize Zelensky as a president. Sometimes they helicopter Yanukovych to Minsk, who is kind of a plan B for Russia. Again, for Ukrainians, it sounds like getting Yanukovych back to Ukraine for the third time. This is really funny. Among all those few things which are funny in Ukraine today. What is going to happen to recently occupied territories? Kherson Oblast is almost totally occupied by the Russians. They are going to create a kind of another people's republic there. So how this, in this future deal, how these occupied territories are going to be featured, yeah? Is Ukraine going to become like a divided country, like post-war Germany, or like South and North Korea? And if there is a peace deal, who is going to guarantee it? How it's going to hold? We know that after 2015, there was this Minsk framework, there was a Normandy format, and somehow there was some mechanism, although it was not working, to establish a stable peace, but it was working to prevent escalation.
Okay, Katharina,
okay.
Thanks very much. I think we need to move on to the next speaker, unless there's something you still want to say.
No, just one sentence. Two questions which are actually all Ukrainians are asking each other. Is there going to be justice for the war crimes committed by the Russian state? And who will pay? And who will rebuild Ukraine? So it's not just Putin dies or retires or withdraws his troops. There is a clear understanding that there is no stable peace without regime change in Russia, and especially in Kharkiv, a city I come from, 40 kilometers from the Russian border. People have this clear understanding. There is no sense to rebuild this city and to come back if there is no kind of clear guarantees of a stable peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tatiana. I want to move to a Russian perspective and ask a question to Katharina Bluhm. I want to spare you the overused question of what does Putin want? Who knows what he wants? But it would be great if you could share your thoughts on the Russian views on the broader consequences of the invasion of Ukraine. Do you reckon that the Russian leadership is prepared for a new world order? Is this something they prepared for? Or was the assumption that Ukraine would fall within a couple of days anyway, and they didn't really plan for this scenario that we're seeing unfold right now? And also, it would be great if you could say a bit more beyond just the political regime in Russia and tell us a bit about broader attitudes on the war in Russia. So we talk a lot about Putin's war, at least in German media, which is probably a good strategy to avoid Russophobia in Germany. But we probably also need to face the fact that large parts of the Russian population still support this invasion, and it would be great to hear your thoughts on this. The floor is yours, Katharina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this invitation to this talk. If I may, I would make a point to your introduction, because I don't think that first the 1990s do not matter. So I will not go into it, but it's not just about hardship. So we should not. If we now see Putin as a historian, and obviously we cannot explain the behavior and this invasion with realpolitik in German, so to speak. It's asked if he's rational or not. For sure, he is guided by ideology. So what he's doing is in any way falling back on Russia. But what I think is that we now in the newspapers we learn more about Ruski Mir, Eurasianism, the Great Russian ideology, and so on. But again, we look back, and as a historian, you're allowed to do this. But I think it's about the future. And we don't understand the behavior of parts of the Russian elites without seeing that there was a movement away from West and Western integration. Medvedev, the president Medvedev, was the last player reapproaching the West. 2011 was membership in the WTO. And there was the idea that Russia can be great again, so to speak, as part of the Western dominated global world. And this has changed after 2012 with the return of Putin. And this was also the beginning of the more serious strategic partnership with China. And it's about, I think, if we look at the future, it's about, of course, Russia as a great power with an imperial self-understanding, but with an understanding to be a strong, not only political and military part, but also economic pole in a so-called multipolar world. That's a dream. Not a bipolar world between China and the US, but a multipolar world where Russia has a place. And the conviction is that Belarus and Ukraine are crucial for this project. In 2012, the Eurasian Bank came up with a report saying, without Ukrainian, no Eurasian Union will be fly, so to speak. Yeah. And if we miss this future perspective, we don't understand also the urgency. Of course, it was a window of opportunity, what looked like a window of opportunity, but it has also some urgency, with Ukrainian turning even more far away from Russia. So was the elite prepared, or was they not prepared? Obviously, they were expecting a short trip, yeah, and for this they felt prepared. So they are energy power, so they expected not much sanctions on this, or at least bearable sanctions. The threat to throw Russia out of SWIFT was already done 2014, and Russia prepared itself by establishing an own payment system, electronic payment system, and by preparing a transnational payment system with China, which is not in place yet, but they worked quite a long time for this. So, and we can also pay our energy in rubles. Yeah. So the idea also that for a while is policy, the so-called de-dollarization of Russian trade. Yeah. So the perception that the dollar is a toxic currency was public talk or official talk in official documents. So they thought that West Europe will not dare to get rid of their energy, but that there will be a financial solutions. They have very little debts, 18% of GDP, so it's very low, and 80% of these debts is domestic, so domestic is from domestic creditors. So so also at that side they felt not so in danger. Yeah. And the reserve fund, even during COVID, Russia managed to bring its reserve fund to a peak which never existed before, not even before 2008, when they spent a lot of their reserves for going over the global financial crisis without help. What they did not expect is that that they have no access to these reserve funds, so an important part of the reserve funds. And this is an indicator, and also the behavior of some actors in this game, that not the whole elite in responsible positions was really involved in this decision, especially the head of the central bank, the finance minister. They did not expect this. So we have elements of preparation, of feeling safe, but at the same time, it was not a coordinated elite preparation of a war economy. Yeah. So, and that's why we see now this irritating behavior of the central bank, the attempts to get rid of many to fix many problems. So oligarchs, what is left from the Yeltsin oligarchs is not important for Russian politics. There are even voices saying, okay, nice, this heritage of the 90s will become under the wing of finally under the wing of the Russian state, and this offshore, the huge offshore capital they have will either return to Russia, or when the NATO states want to keep it. So what? It's not even important. So there's also the expectation that with more borders, this capital outflow will be reduced. So there are many points which gave obviously some of the elites a feeling that they are well prepared, but it was not a coordinated action of the elite, and that's why we see a kind of inconsistent preparation.
Thank you, Katharina. Could you still say a little bit on the perception in the Russian population at large?
Yeah.
We have anecdotal evidence. Also, I hear this from Russian friends that their parents completely buy into state propaganda. That we hear probably tricky figures from polls, but nonetheless, what we hear is that still the majority of the Russian population buys into the portrayal of the conflict as it is presented on Russian state media. What is your sense? How deep are the convictions of the majority of the Russian population? Do they really share this view that they're in a sort of a civilizational struggle against a decadent West, or is this just a rather short-term influence of the propaganda of the past years?
I think this.
What answer, please?
Yeah, I think this is part of the ideology production and construction, and not really taken seriously. But what is taken seriously is this anti-Western, anti-NATO that these anti-NATO and anti-Western attitudes exist, and it also shows us, the service shows this, and so this is a long development to have this anti-Western, anti-NATO perception, and that Russia is again a victim, and that this propaganda works also. It's not so clear who started it, so fake news. So they managed really to make to throw a lot of gray color on this issue. So that, but I really think it resonates. This anti-NATO, the feeling that Russia is not respected by the West, is a strong motor, and this has to do with the 1990s, by the way, or the development in general. So, and this is, I have the same experience as you, students, colleagues, Russian students here in Berlin, saying that they broke up with their parents or friends, that they do not listen, that they are not ready for any arguments. Are they only brainwashed? Does propaganda is so effective? Obviously it is, but it resonates, and it resonates with some feelings of being rejected or being a victim, and not recognized. So this kind of feeling, I think, exists.
Yeah, I totally agree with your interpretation of the relevance of the 1990s and this experience of defeat, of humiliation. I'm totally convinced that this plays an important role for the imperial mindset of the elite today. I have my doubts about the role of the West and NATO and all of this. I suppose this would have
I agree with you that the NATO, that they feel not threats about the NATO. That's not the point. But if you want to build, if you want to claim a region as your own, as in a multipolar world, then always the West is invading ideologically, culturally, economically, and also with NATO and European Union. So this is a whole bunch, not the NATO as such.
Thanks very much, Katharina. Let's move on and let's look beyond Russia and Ukraine at the reactions in the West, the reactions globally. And I want to start with a question for Thomas Risse. Now, the German Chancellor, in his speech in the Bundestag right after the Russian invasion, has spoken of a ZEITENWENDE, of a sea change for both the liberal world order and German foreign policy. Now, we've heard this many times before. For at least 20 years, there's talk about the return of geopolitics. There's talk in Germany about the importance of Germany taking a more active stance in international politics. Can you tell us what is different this time now? How will this translate into different policy today? And also tell us a bit about the changes that you foresee for the international liberal order.
Thank you, Tobias. Can you hear me? Am I? Okay, I'll just go ahead. I do think it's a sea change. At the same time, I have to say the change in Western politics comes way too late, but you'll hear that in a second. I mean, the first thing is to understand the world order consequence of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. It's not just an outright attack on the liberal international order and its components, for example, principle multilateralism, peaceful resolution of conflicts, respect for human rights, etc., etc., it's actually also an attack on the so-called Westphalian international order that is based on the sovereign equality of states, the non-interference in internal affairs, and the inviolability of borders. And interestingly enough, these were principles that were upheld by Russia and China over the last 20 years, mostly against Western intrusion with regard to democracy and human rights. On the side, the aggression has destroyed the European peace and security order. And this order goes, and you're all talking about the 1990s here. I have a different interpretation of the 1990s, but I don't want to go there. Actually, it starts in 1975. In 1975, the old Soviet Union and the West, including the US and Canada, agreed on the Helsinki Final Act that had essentially all the principle in there on which the post-Cold War order, starting with the 1990 Paris Charter and other declarations, were then built. So that's my first point. So in that sense, it is really a sea change. My second point is, and this follows up to Katharina, but takes a very different point, because if this is about respect, etc., I think this is gone, finally. Because no matter what happens on the ground in the Ukraine, and we can talk about this later, I'm very, very pessimistic, because the military campaign by Russia is now continuing what they did in Chechnya. It's the Syrian strategy, etc. So I'm very pessimistic there. But the overall picture is that Putin and Russia as a whole have already lost. As long as Putin and his cronies are in power in Moscow, and whatever autocratic regime follows there, Russia will be cut out of the international order. And that includes the liberal economic international order. Just in reply to Katharina, Russia currently has no access to 50% of its own currency reserves. And this will have enormous consequences. Russia will be isolated for the time being, politically, culturally, economically, etc. And this includes scientific cooperation. And we could see that with the UN General Assembly resolution. Putin's Russia is now among the so-called rogue states, such as Syria and North Korea. These were among those that joined Russia in voting against that resolution. So Putin has shown time and again that he and his cronies are unable to keep what we call in international relations credible, to make credible commitments. And that means that you keep promises and respect international rules and institutions. And finally, if this whole thing was about to keep democracy and human rights out of the Russian periphery and its neighborhood, this attempt will have failed too. Moldova and Georgia will move even closer to the EU and to NATO. And, I'm absolutely sure that other countries in the Southern Caucasus will look at this extremely nervously. My third point is on the consequences for the Western part of the liberal international order. One has to go back for a very, very long time in the history of the transatlantic security community to see it as united as today. The US has shifted very quickly its attention from Asia to Europe, including military reinforcement. And the Biden administration has put China on notice that it will face severe economic repercussions if it tries to throw a lifeline to Russia and somehow tries to circumvent Western sanctions. Tobias, you mentioned Scholz and his speech. European firms, including energy companies, are disinvesting from Russia at a very, very high speed. There's a little bit of good news in this whole thing. This will probably speed up the transition to renewables, since reliance on fossil fuels not only contributes to global warming, it also becomes a major security risk, as we have seen in the past weeks. Last point, the solidarity with the Ukrainian people has so far been overwhelming. Just go to the Berlin Central Station, and I just hope that it keeps its way in the coming months. So likely scenarios. I start with the European security order. As to the latter, I think I doubt that it can be repaired as long as Putin and his oligarchs are in power. At best, we can hope for some type of stalemate. We can talk about this maybe in the Q&A. For me, the real question is whether the EU, the US, and NATO will remain united as much in the coming months and years when the war fades in the memory. Will the turnaround of German foreign policy be followed by deeds? What will the EU do? Tanja will talk about this. Will Germany and the EU finally get their act together and shoulder global responsibility? And Tobias, you exactly mentioned that, as they promised for years and years and years. I think we're in a different situation. I think this is a wake-up call, but I want to see the deeds first. Last not least, we should not forget that we have our own internal contestations of the liberal script in Europe and North America. And I'm not just talking about Poland and Hungary. I have a nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario is that Le Pen, or even worse, Eric Zemmour, will be elected French president in the spring, and that in November 2024, we will have to face either Donald Trump or another right-wing Republican in the White House. This means, as a consequence, again, on this point, responding to your question, Tobias, we have exactly 2 years in Europe to get our act together. That is not much time. My very last point is a normative one. Putin's aggression against Ukraine reminds us in Europe and elsewhere that the liberal order, whether international or domestic, does not come for free. It has to be defended every single day, and this includes us as scholars. And here I have to simply quote the statement of the Scripps doctoral researchers. They put it very succinctly. I quote, "As scholars, our duty does not simply end at intellectual truth. We are beholden to a moral truth that may call upon us to cross professional boundaries to uphold that which is morally and ethically correct." Thank you.
Thomas, let's hope the more optimistic scenarios will develop. Of course, I mean, talking about Germany especially, I mean, we put ourselves in a very comfortable position over the past years, putting our, I don't know, shifting labor to China, getting our energy cheap from Russia, and our defense from the United States. So I appreciate the change in rhetoric that we now hear from German politics, but let's see how much this will actually be transferred to actual changes in politics. Let's see. I want to move a bit beyond the West now, and we have two distinguished speakers, experts on China and then India. And I want to start with China, and a question for Lunting. Lunting, can you give us a sense of the reactions to the Ukraine war in China? So which threats, which perhaps also opportunities does the Chinese government see in this crisis? So we know that Xi Jinping and Putin personally have found each other quite inspiring, but how is it in the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party actually? Are there perhaps people having second thoughts about the merits of strongman rule? It would also be interesting to hear a bit about the public debate in China, if there is one. This is something I haven't read or heard of in Western media so far at all. What I did hear is that in Taiwan, there is now a tremendous fascination for the resilience of Ukrainians, and they're studying closely the military strategy of the defense forces in Ukraine. But what's the reaction in mainland China?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Tobias, for the introduction. And before answering the question, I would like to take a moment to extend my personal thoughts to Tatiana and her family and friends and acquaintances that are being affected by this crisis in Ukraine. And coming back to the question, and in response to the China's reaction of the ongoing crisis, I would like to approach this kind of reaction in two parts. One part is about the discursive reaction, in a sense that what China is reacting discursively to this crisis, and the other one is more about the reaction in more of a practical sense. And in terms of its discourse, we might also distinguish the discourse towards a foreign audience and a discourse towards a domestic audience, because they are kind of different. In terms of the discourse, a discursive reaction towards the foreign audience, we might see that China is neither condemning nor condoning the Russian aggression towards Ukraine. We have seen that in China, high-level officials have mainly used two kinds of discourses. The one is, of course, as the previous panelists have mentioned about, that China has been always adhering to the sovereignty and territorial integrity, and is traces back to the 5 principles of coexistence, and also its opposition, long-standing opposition against regime change. So we might see that this is one part of the discourse, in the sense that China and the officials, high-level officials, express time and again that it's kind of adhere to the sovereignty and territorial integrity. And another part of the discourse is that, interestingly, it also says that all parties should respect the legitimate security concerns. And China actually echoes the Russian interpretation of the indivisible security principle enshrined in the Paris Charter. So why is it the case that China is kind of also echoing the Russian interpretation of the indivisible security principle? And actually, in the Paris Charter, there is not a clear definition of what indivisible security actually means. Well, if we look at the Chinese discourse, then it always says that one country's security interest cannot be at the expense of that of the others. And we have seen that China also kind of resorts to this kind of discourse more and more frequently. Why is it the case? Then China would argue that the recent developments in its immediate neighborhoods, and also in the context of the US sanctions dating back from the Trump administration, might hurt its sphere of influence, in a sense that, for example, the foreign minister of China on a press conference last weekend said that the US and the Western allies are kind of forming a security bloc that is not in the security interest of the others. We might see the Five Eyes alliance that has been mentioned by the foreign minister, and also the quadrilateral security dialogue involving India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, and also the AUKUS alliance that has been formed last year, the trilateral alliance, and also the US-Taiwan Mutual Defense Pact. So I think that Beijing feels that its sphere of influence is also kind of threatened, and then it echoes the Russian interpretation of the indivisible security principle. And as long as, in my opinion, Beijing is struggling between its long-standing adherence to sovereignty and also territorial integrity on the one hand, and the Russian interpretation and its echoing, its resonance with this kind of interpretation of indivisible security principle, then it is likely that it's going to adopt more, continue adopting this kind of ambiguous stance. And one might interpret that it's kind of a normative struggle. The other way to interpret it might be that it's an intentional hedging strategy that Beijing is adopting in a highly uncertain context. A hedging strategy means that one actor is adopting opposing kind of positions in response to a highly uncertain context. Now, that's for the Chinese discursive reaction towards the foreign audience. What about the domestic audience, that is kind of included in your question as well? Then when we look at this reaction in the domestic audience, we have to understand that the domestic kind of rhetoric and also that the media is highly under state control and also censorship. So there have been a lot of reports about the Chinese government issuing directives to filter pro-Ukraine discourse. One example might be that right after the Russian invasion into Ukraine, an open letter was signed by 5 very distinguished scholars from 5 top universities of China, condemning the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And this kind of open letter was taken down immediately. And when facing domestic scores, when we talk about the domestic scores, and there's this clear leaning, in my sense, towards Moscow, which can be exemplified by the citations or reposting of news from Russian resources. For example, the latest this kind of action by China's state-controlled media of reposting or citing Russian sources might be the US developing bioweapons or chemical weapons in Russia, so as to kind of dilute the accusations from the West against China about the origin of the COVID-19. Partially is the intention. And also there has been some reports about Russian forces attacking the power plant in Ukraine, saying that, okay, it's the Ukrainian forces attacking it first, and then the Russians were going to protect it, and this kind of things. So we see that China's state official media outlets have reposted and cited a lot of Russian sources in reporting the ongoing warfare in Ukraine. And more than 50%, as survey shows, that pro-Russia posts were circulating on the Chinese social media like Twitter, which is Weibo, targeting around 500,000 of the users of 500 billion of users in China. And now, moving on to the practical level, what China is practically doing in response to the Russian aggression. We have seen that on the international fora, for example, China has abstained from the votings from the United Security Council, the United States, the United Nations Security Council, United Nations General Assembly, and also the UNHCR. On the other hand, I would like to especially draw attention to a recent development. 1.5 weeks ago, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is sponsored mostly by China, in which China holds a 30% of voting share as well, has decided to suspend all economic activities related to Russia and Belarus with immediate effect. And Russia, as a founding member of the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is also part of the bank. And in the decision, the bank has raised the concerns about the financial integrity and also the repayment capacity of Russia and Belarus, which are under the Western sanctions. And China has raised grave concerns about their and the AIIB has raised grave concerns about their repayment capability. And we have seen that actually the AIIB has approved $800 million of loans or lending towards Russia and 200 million loans towards Belarus, and they are put on hold right now. And apart from that, China also, the Chinese commercial banks have also halted a lot of issuing the letters of credits to Russia. And we might kind of learn from the experience of why China, especially the banking sectors, are reluctant to engage furthermore with Russia and Belarus from the previous experience of Venezuela. After the West imposed kind of very hard sanctions against the Maduro regime, a lot of Chinese banking sector are actually very reluctant to provide new lendings towards the Maduro regime with the fear of that they were not being able to repay the debts. And we have also seen that right after the shelling of the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, China was among the first countries to urge Russia to keep the nuclear power plant safe. So that is to say that on the discursive level and on the practical level, there's this kind of nuanced difference between the two. And in terms of the threats and benefits you have mentioned, I will just quickly go on to that as well. We have seen, in terms of the threats, first of all, we have seen that yesterday, just yesterday on the phone call between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the Spanish Foreign Minister Jose Manuel Alvarez, the Chinese minister actually said that, and I quote, "China is not a party directly involved in the crisis and does not want to be affected by sanctions even more." So we have seen that China has been very reluctant or very afraid of getting too much involved in the current sanctions imposed by the West. And especially it's in the context of a a special year this year in China, in which President Xi Jinping is expected to continue his third term in office. And so any spillover of the Ukrainian crisis and warfare towards the internal affairs or economy of China might not be desirable. And another threat towards China might be that China's biggest concern is the unprecedented transatlantic unity that has been shown by the West in response to the Russian aggression. And of course, in the long run, we've talked about Germany right now, but in the long run, we have seen that in Japan, there this kind of rhetoric released by the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, saying that Japan should consider hosting nuclear forces from the United States, and that has been refuted very fiercely by China because of the Taiwan issues, and also because of the maritime disputes with its neighboring countries. And with respect to other kind of risks that China might get too much involved with Russia, then it's actually we might see that after the annexation of Crimea, actually China and Ukraine relationship have been not that bad as a lot of people have assumed. Actually, in order for Ukraine to reduce the dependency of its energy on Russia, China has helped Ukraine retrofit its power plant so as to reduce this kind of energy dependency on Russia. And actually in 2020 and 2021, $2 billion of new engineering projects were granted to Ukraine. And there have been also dredging ports, this kind of projects conducted in Odessa, and also $5 million of investments from a very big Chinese agriculture giant have been approved to operate in Mariupol. And on the other hand, also Ukraine has served as a very strategic transition point for China's Belt and Road Initiative. And actually President Zelensky has said that it wanted Ukraine to be a gateway for China to Europe. So we have seen that Ukraine actually has kind of this very strategic, standpoint or point for Beijing. And the other one might be the risk in this whole context might be the military cooperation between China and Ukraine. Some of the observers might say that China's airspace power, the secret weapon for China's airspace power, is actually Ukraine, because Ukraine has helped time and again China to modernize its weaponry, and it's one of the main suppliers of military weapons to China as well. It also helped China to build up its first aircraft carrier, and which became the kind of national pride of China. So the Ukrainian military experts and scientists were willing to help China to develop this kind of technologies that Russia might not be willing to do so. So losing Ukraine and losing, or let's say that if there's a regime change in Ukraine, might strategically dampen China's military cooperation with a strategic military partner.
Thanks, Valentin. I think I need to interfere here because we're running out of time. Can I just ask you to say something really, really quick about this Taiwan connection? Because this is such an obvious connection that's constantly made in the West. Is this something that is being discussed in China as well, publicly, internally? I don't know. If you just could say 2 or 3 sentences on this, and then we have to move on to the next speaker.
Yes, of course. The official discourse is that Taiwan and Ukraine are categorically different issues, because China recognized Ukraine as a sovereign country, is one of the first countries to recognize the independence of Ukraine. However, Taiwan is, in China's opinion, official opinion, belongs to China. So there's this categorically different affairs. In terms of in public debate, then also because of the state propaganda influence, and also a lot of people kind of also relate to the Russian aggression in Ukraine as kind of a reference point for China's future reunification with Taiwan?
Well, a lot of people in the Russian elite probably see this quite similarly because they see Ukraine as part of Russia. Zhenting, thanks very much for this these very interesting insights into the Chinese reactions, which were rather cautious. And I think something similar we see happening in India. The official India has been very cautious with its reactions to the Ukraine war. There was, to my knowledge, no official condemnation of the invasion. They abstained from the vote in the General Assembly in the UN. Salma, can you help us understand this reaction a bit? What is this about? Is this about the current internationalist government and their particular relationship with the Putin regime, or is this something deeper? Is this something that has, I don't know, historical roots that go back to this old Soviet-Indian collaboration? And linking up to Zhenting's talk, what is the role of China here, which I suppose plays an important role in the geopolitical game that India sees itself in?
So thank you for those questions, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this roundtable. I think India, currently being the non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has also drawn a lot of attention to how India is responding, and people have been looking at the voting patterns. And India has abstained in all the three, resolutions which have been brought. So how does one understand this? And I think it's important to put it in the context of the conduct of foreign policy over an extended period of time. It's too simplistic to say that India is, avoiding to take sides, or that, we are, not being part of a camp. This is precisely part of the old historical development of Indian foreign policy, which has been grounded in one very important word called non-alignment. And non-alignment should not be seen as neutrality. What it had effectively meant was India's not ready to join this kind of a bloc politics, which will just put it on one side irrespective of how things would play out. On the other hand, I think India has made use of the fact that just because it has lines of communications open with Moscow, it has decided to use this and say that in order to engage, and has called upon both the parties to find a way forward through the diplomatic channels, that is to get back to the negotiating table and that war be brought to an end soon. In all of this, what many people may not be aware also is that India had a sizable number of students who are studying in Ukraine, about 20,000 who had to be also brought out safely, which, I would not say had an impact on the way India is, voting at the United Nations, but these are the other concerns which obviously don't get reported and said. I think more importantly, the question is, what is the political, economic, and security calculus for New Delhi? And it's not a simple question of either you are with the democracy team or you are with the non-democracy team. I think this kind of a reductionist analysis serves no kind of purpose. What should be understood over here is that for all states, these questions will impact very differently. I think Europe's reaction also is seen in the sense of the near proximity of the war, which has broken out now right on the European doorstep. In that sense, the luxury of geography may be available to others, but it doesn't offer you a luxury from escaping the impact of what such a conflict does to every country's foreign policy, specifically given that we're living in such an interconnected, globalized world. So having said that, I think one has to put India's concerns on a larger perspective, which is that, diplomacy is the best way forward, but also look at where are India's own engagements, with all the concerned parties. With Russia itself, 50% of our defense platform is, right from the Soviet time, continues into the present, is still coming through Russia. That plays a very important part, also including the servicing and the spare parts. We also are importing oil, from Russia. Many are not even aware that India imports almost 75% of cooking oil, one particular cooking oil from Ukraine. So this conflict, in that sense, impacts us in a major way. And just by passing a resolution, if things would happen, I will draw attention of everybody participating in the debate to a question which is posed to us at the outset. Can great powers do what they want? And at one level, the simple answer would be yes. Let's not forget 2003, when the evidence was presented in the United Nations Security Council on Iraq. And we know that how France and Germany did not agree with that. So I think it's important to situate what one is seeing in the context of what are the specific political, economic, and security concerns. This does not mean to say that values have, no place, or what we call as the liberal order needs to be set aside. I think it's important to understand what is the context. In all of this, what we are talking about. It's very interesting that the European Union still continues to get Russian energy. That has not been turned off. So I think, that means your primary interest of seeing that your energy dependence, which cannot be immediately changed in a couple of days, continues. The sanctions will play out in a different way. But that dependency, which cannot be done away, is exempt from the sanctions. So one needs to put these issues into the larger context. Point number two, India also has a strong engagement with the West, with the United States. So we have a strategic partnership with both sides, not only with Moscow, but also with Washington. There have also been talk that since India has got latest, the S-400 missiles from Russia, that, there would be now sanctions imposed on India and the CAATSA. But there have been also a lot of voices around in Washington which has said that there should be a much more thought out way of interacting with India, and not doing a knee-jerk reaction of imposing sanctions. I think it's also important to put this thing in a important perspective, at looking at why India is reluctant to simply jump a bandwagon and join in this. Because when India has been faced with issues where we've had incursions on Indian territory from both sides, on the western side and on the eastern side from Pakistan and from China, we've not seen an automatic reaction from the West to stand up and support India. Or when we've had the case of low intensity conflict and terrorism happening on Indian territory. So I think all of this really begs the question that it's not a simple issue of just drawing lines cleanly on a map and saying that okay, you join a particular group. In all of this, let's also point out, if you're talking about the ZEITENWENDE for Germany, in 2005, as Schroeder his term was coming to an end, Nord Stream 2 was launched by Germany. What did that say? Germany was willing to even bypass the rest of the European Union and draw up its own pipeline deal with Russia, which has continued right up to the point where this rupture has taken place. So I think it's extremely important not to brush aside large swaths of history, but to look at actually the real detailed, what I would say is interconnections which exist between countries, and it is in those details. As I say, the devil lies in the details that one has to be able to understand. And India's, this does not mean to say that the challenges for India don't rise. India also has a stake in one of the oil blocks. So India recently put out a global tender for selling Russian oil, which drew a blank. So that means India also has an impact where it is also dealing with it, where it has this oil where it can sell. There have been reports where Moscow has offered low-cost, oil to India. There are discussions going on, and I think there will be countries which will be quick to jump and say that India is taking sides in the conflict. I would say that show me when the European Union says that it is going to stop taking oil and gas from Russia tomorrow. So in some ways, every purchase of oil and gas by the EU every day is also fueling the conflict. I think that also needs to be put on the table. At the end of the day, what I believe is that every country, is looking at its own national interest first, and that's what drives foreign policy. If you talk of the impact on what we call as the liberal order or the liberal international order, I think you've got to separate these three different words. There is something, a content of what is liberal or what we believe it to be liberal. You can ask how do everybody, engage with that. There is something called the notion of the international, and then the third is the order. I think a good metaphor by which I would like to, conclude my preliminary remarks is to think of it as being at a traffic light. The traffic light, helps us to regulate and reduce the transaction costs. So the assumption is that everybody will, buy into it, right? But there are going to be people repeatedly who break away from it, and I think the great powers do that. The view from the global south is it's a matter of convenience. It's not just about 20 years back when we had the vote on Iraq in the UN Security Council. Why forget that when the evidence didn't prove anything? So the traffic light also shows that the traffic is not made up of uniformly the same kind of vehicles. There are some big cars, small cars. In India, you will even have the bullock cart traveling with the cycle, which also tells you that power available to states is a function of many different factors. And not everybody is going to be, having the first right of way, but everybody tries to use what I would call the so-called order to reduce transaction costs. So repeatedly, there are incursions which happen on this so-called order. How good is it? How resilient it is? I think that is something which is what we are debating. And I think you've got to be able to put the conflict in perspective. When a war happens on a European territory, it may be hurting the Europeans a lot. What happens when a war happens in Africa? The luxury of space then, is afforded. But that's what I said today. That's not a choice for many in terms of foreign policy. At the end of the day, what everybody is doing is hedging bets and looking at how best they can, negotiate and come out of it. And what's also important, I think, is you've got to have some doors open if diplomacy is one way which we all still endorse, right? So I think India, would have good officers to offer in terms of being able to talk, because we did use, the Prime Minister did talk to both leaders, remember, when all the Indian students, 20,000 of them, had to be moved out, not only from neighboring countries, but also from borders very close to Russia in particular.
Thanks very much, Salma. We come now full circle of the global reactions in China and India. We get back to Europe and reactions at the level of the European Union. Tanja, what do you think are the reactions at the level of the European Union? Is this a Zeitenwende for the European Union as well? Will the European Union get their act together and do something to be recognized as a serious international actor as well? I don't think they were so far, at least not in Moscow. Your views.
Thank you so much, Tobias. I hope you can hear me. Can we good? I am I'm chiming in from Wyoming in the United States. But I resist the temptation to talk about the US. Thomas has already done so I will focus on the EU. Let me start with a general remark about the Eurocentricness of the debate. I'm glad that this roundtable helped to open the perspectives we heard from India and from China, and I think this is important to keep in mind. But why for the Europeans feel that this is indeed a sea change has certainly, as Salma already remarked, to do with the fact that this is the first war of aggression in Europe since the Second World War. We've lived in peace and security for more than 70 years. And for some, it seems to be a return to the Cold War. I'm not sure about that. But I think on a more general level, a lot of people would feel that we did not really see this coming, although Katharina Bluhm is absolutely right. I think we could have seen this coming. And so those who thought this might be coming then disagreed on how to prevent what might be coming. And then there are those who have no clue of how to deal with this, the mess we are now in, right? Because we failed to see it coming, or we disagreed on how to prevent what has been coming. Now, to me, I'd like to take a slightly different angle. Why I originally actually thought this could be a sea change for the European Union, because for the first time in decades, the European Union really has stood united, right, and has found in a very short time a rather, at least for the European Union, forceful response to Putin's assault, not only on Ukraine, but as Thomas said, on Europe's peace and security order. So that, in a sense, is by many interpreted as a sea change for the European Union, because it seems that the European Union finally is getting its act together. And here I want to just mention one thing. In the cluster of contestations of the liberal script, we make a distinction between internal and external contestations to the liberal script. For a long time, because of Trump and right-wing populism in Europe, we focused on internal contestations. Now, with Putin's war in Ukraine, this is clearly an external contestation, but there is a link here. So you could argue the external contestation by Putin has silenced for the moment the internal contestations within the European Union, has brought on board people like Orban, and but also in countries like Italy, Russian-friendly countries, and even the Social Democrats in Germany seem to have understood that Wandel durch Annäherung, peace or change through engagement is not really an option when dealing with Putin. So you could say, for the time being, one of the explanations why Europe stands so united, also with the US, by the way, where Republicans strongly support Ukraine and try to ignore Trump's comments on Putin, it sort of silences for the time being internal contestations of the liberal script within liberal states that have undermined the capacity of liberal states to defend the liberal international order in the past. Now, why I'm not too optimistic still is because Ursula von der Leyen might have been right when she, in her last State of the Union, said it's the political willingness of the member states that is lacking for Europe to play a more geopolitical role, and not the instruments. Everything is there. The member states just have to use it. And you could say now, with Putin's war, the Europeans finally have understood that they have to get their act together. And now we're going to engage in a real common foreign security policy that deserves the name of a common policy. We also see a change in the approach of Central Eastern European countries towards migration. We have millions of Ukrainians that are welcome in Poland and even in Hungary. So some people now hope for a reform of the Schengen regime, where we finally can talk about the relocation of refugees among member states. And thirdly, the whole energy transition, the Green Deal, gets a major boost, because when we have started to disinvest, Salma is absolutely right, we did not join the oil embargo of the United States, but what you can clearly see is that we're moving away not only from Russia and its oil and gas, but there's a general push towards investing in renewables in order to become less dependent on countries like Russia. So this all seems to sound great. Lots of hope for the European Union as a united actor, taking up a stronger role in defending the liberal international order. So let me conclude by why I am skeptic that this is going to last. And this is something we have not really talked about it. We have Thomas remarked that freedom is not for free, and I fully agree, but the question is, who is going to pay the price? And there is a clear bias towards, those who are already disadvantaged. They will have to foot more of the bill of this war than others. And so let me start with the money that we're currently investing particularly in Germany, in rearming, or actually one should say in finally equipping our army, right, to be able to fight. I think this is important, but at the same time, this will cost a lot of money. And the question is, this is not going to be more money. This money will be taken away someplace else. So first point. Second point, the refugees, the relocation. I'm not entirely sure how long the solidarity with Ukraine will last, and once we reach 4-6 million refugees, depending on how this war will end. And again, here this will cost a lot of money in accommodating these refugees. The question is, where will this money be taken from? And thirdly, the Green Deal, the energy transition. This has a clear social dimension. We currently see it with the gas prices going up, not only in Germany, but in other countries. This hurts people with lower incomes much more than people with higher incomes. And that social question, if that is not going to be addressed, will contribute to refueling the internal contestations of the liberal script that have been currently silenced by Russia, by Putin's war, right? We have an election in France coming up. So, the question is, how long will the solidarity with Ukraine hold in order to paper over these internal contestations, many of which evolve around issues of social inequality, which arguably will be reinforced by our attempts to counter the external contestations of the liberal script by Putin.
Oops. Thanks very much, Tanja. Now, I'm afraid, as usual, we've overrun quite a bit. I think most of the questions that we got per email were already addressed in the discussion by the speakers so far. Several of them concerned different world regions that we didn't talk about and reactions in these parts of the world. And I think one might be important, should be talked about at least briefly, and that is Central Eastern Europe. So I suppose, Katharina, you're the most qualified to answer this question. What do you think are what are the reactions in the Visegrad countries in Central Europe, and what is the perception there? Is this also a Zeitenwende for people there, and how do they perceive, perhaps you can say something about this as well, how do they perceive the change in policies in Germany?
This is difficult. I have no data and surveys now for this. What I observe two things that I think for Orban, it's a quite interesting lecture to learn that that Putin is playing a hard game, and so I observe some more reluctance in his optimism to play as Belarus and Ukraine did for a while, to play with different sides. So that I think matters. For Poland, I have some more information also from colleagues, and what we observe a huge solidarity, but this is almost only private solidarity. So the Polish government was not prepared. They really dismantled the institutional instruments to deal with migration crisis. So they have no distribution system, nothing. So what we observe, this high solidarity, is really only private and only NGOs. And this is, of course, is also an overloading of this population, and this would be the big question. If really is Poland changing its policy, is really establishing this kind of instruments. So what I see at the moment, it's reluctant to do this. So at least we have 3 weeks now. They could do more now, and we see nothing. And there's a huge differentiation between the Ukrainian people, which were already in Poland. 1 million people work already in Poland. These are the cultural right people, yeah. And this, that you cannot simply say that will will change the attitude towards people from Africa or from Syria or something else. So this is what I observe, but what I also is pretty clear is the solidarity. So there is huge solidarity and also fear, really fear. That and we get questions: what happens? Will really the NATO protect us, and so on? So the fear is really heavy.
And what is the perception of Germany putting another 100 billion euros into the defense budget? How do you political leaders in Eastern Central Europe react to this? Do you know anything about this?
I would have to guess to answer this question. So because this was always ambivalent. I think on the one hand, I think it was registered that now the German government is on the right side and is cutting. This is even more important. It's cutting. They're always suspicious of special relationships, and with this clear decision, it's also clear that Germany is not playing a double game anymore. So at least for now, I think this is dominant perception. But on the other hand, there was always a lot of concerns, especially in Poland, but also in Hungary, to be dominated by Germany in the European Union. So if you look at the propaganda of peace, Germany was always one of the hate figures. Miss Merkel as Nazi, as Hitler. Such kind of pictures were officially seen in streets. So this is ambivalent. We have to wait. As long as Germany is a strong part of the transatlantic system and not trying to play its own game with France, this suspicion might be less visible, but I don't think that's gone.
Thanks very much, Katharina. We are almost at the end. I don't want to end this discussion on a too gloomy note. I see that Tatiana wants to say something.
If I may, I just briefly wanted to comment on this last question discussed. I did some research in the Ukrainian-Polish borderlands recently, and it is clear for me that countries like Poland, but also Hungary and Slovakia, they liberalized their migration law to attract more Ukrainian labor force, and this crisis, which of course resulted in a huge wave of Ukrainians fleeing from war, but most of this first wave, people who reached EU countries, these are mostly like middle-class people, educated people with young children. And if this war continues like that, these people are likely to stay in these countries, and countries suffering already from this depopulation and from the effects of mass labor immigration to the West, like Poland and Bulgaria and Slovakia. So they in the long run, they are actually going to profit from this.
Thank you, Tatiana. Katharina, you wanted to get back to Tatiana, but please very briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if we talk about isolation of Russia, we should a little bit more careful. And we got today impressive insights of how China is thinking and how is India thinking. So we have really to observe how the countries respond, and this is a lot of policy going on. There's a lot of policy going on, but I would be careful. It's an open question how isolated Russia will be. I'm not so sure that the Western sanction will hold that strong and get this kind of response from the whole world. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to give the final word to Thomas Risse, because he gave us a very gloomy perspective in your talk before, and I don't want to send people home with such a, I don't know, apocalyptic mood. So can you, Thomas, please give us the most optimistic scenario how we can get out of this situation, and or at least the least horrible path out of this situation for the international liberal order, for Russia, for Ukraine, for the rest of the world?
Okay, my most optimistic. I start with Russia. I don't know where it's coming from, but regime change in Russia. That would, of course, change the equation. Second, my optimistic version, as a response to also Lun Ting. China is in a very difficult situation at the moment. Very difficult. Because just one sentence on Taiwan. On the one hand, the West has accepted the one China, two systems approach. So in that sense, it shares the Chinese view. On the other hand, and unlike Ukraine, Taiwan has a military security guarantee from the United States of America, which means should Xi Jinping have any thoughts of doing anything with Taiwan, he's going to be in a military conflict. At least he cannot exclude that he's in a military conflict with the US. So also China is in a very different position economically. The Chinese economic growth, as one of the reasons why the Chinese regime survives, is tied into economic globalization. It cannot afford to lose its ties. So I might disagree with Katharina how much Russia can afford to be isolated economically. That's a thing. But China for sure cannot do this. So you wanted my optimistic version. If I was China and look at this at the moment, I would be very, very careful what the kind of options I have and how to deal with the West in the future. My last point, optimistic version, that Tanja with her skepticism is not right, that this time, finally, particularly Germany, follows up words with deeds. By the way, on the discussion we had before, the Baltic states were asking us to do more for the common defense for pretty much since they've been in NATO. Yeah? Poland is more ambiguous. I agree with Katharina on that one. So there are a couple of optimistic
If
issues.
I may, as I don't want to be blamed here for being the pessimist, in the room. There is one very positive and optimistic message. The European Union has accepted a membership perspective of Ukraine, which automatically means that Moldova and Georgia will also have a membership. I'm talking about perspective. This is not about candidate status, and it's certainly not a fast track to EU membership. But again, von der Leyen clearly said, Ukraine is part of the European family. That has huge implications. This is not merely symbolic. Let me remind you how much we fought about in the European Union about these kind of statements. And again, there was a unanimous statement by the European Union and its 27 member states that Ukraine is part of Europe and hence, of course, has a membership perspective. When exactly Ukraine will join the European Union is a different matter, but I think this is certainly something that should not be forgotten. So on that happy note, I shut up now and thank everybody for this great roundtable.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to all the presenters. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today and listened to the discussion. We have to finish now. I know a lot more could be discussed, and it's probably not the most optimistic scenario that we could offer for a conclusion here, but this is all we have, and we have to finish here. Thanks very much again, and have a good night.